Imagine waking up to find a bright orange sticker slapped on your Coast Guard boat, labeled abandoned, by your local HOA Karen. What she didn't know. That boat belonged to the US government, and she was about to go toe-to-toe with federal law. It all began on a quiet Saturday morning. One of those calm, golden moments when the world feels right. I had just stepped outside, cup of coffee in hand, ready to breathe in the salt air and enjoy the peace that came with living near the water. My plan was simple. Glance over the boat, do a light systems check, and maybe soak in some sun. A rare off day. But that peaceful moment didn't last long. From the corner of my eye, I noticed someone standing near the dock. Someone I didn't recognize at first. I squinted a little, confused. She stood stiffly, armed with a clipboard and an air of self-importance that didn't quite match the laid-back coastal vibe. Wearing oversized sunglasses, a pastel polo shirt, and an expression of permanent dissatisfaction, this woman practically screamed HOA board member. And then it hit me. I'd heard murmurs in the neighborhood. That's Karen. What gave her away, more than anything, was the deep frown carved onto her face. Not the kind you get from a bad morning. This was a frown of judgment, carefully cultivated over the years and reserved for moments like this, when something didn't fit her version of how things should be. Without a greeting, without so much as a hello, she turned to me, narrowed her eyes, and said something that truly made me stop in my tracks. "Sir, your boat's been abandoned. I'm tagging it for removal under HOA guidelines." I literally blinked at her. Abandoned? Really? That was her takeaway from a clean, well-maintained, clearly active-duty vessel that I'd only docked here recently? I glanced toward the boat like I might be seeing it wrong. No rust. No mildew. Fully operational and cleaned weekly. Not exactly cast-off Titanic vibes. For context, this wasn't a regular fishing boat or weekend pontoon. This was a U.S. Coast Guard support vessel, equipped with emergency gear and communication arrays. Due to some unexpected maintenance being done at our local base, I had been granted temporary approval to keep it near my residence, a rare but not unheard of move when dealing with active-duty assets. And more importantly, I'm not just some guy with a boat. I'm an active-duty Coast Guard officer, currently stationed in the very city Karen decided needed cleaning up. I calmly answered her, making sure to keep my tone level. "Ma'am, this isn't an abandoned boat. It's federal property being stationed here temporarily. I have full authorization for it." But that apparently wasn't what she wanted to hear. I watched her give the boat another once-over, as if her personal judgment carried more weight than any government ID or clearance level I might possess. She waved me off, like I had just invented a story to get out of a parking ticket. No exceptions. All watercraft left beyond the property line for more than 48 hours without HOA registration are considered abandoned under subsection 3.2. She snapped, not even looking up from her clipboard as she started writing something down. "I'm taking photos and submitting them to the board. Expect a citation." A citation? On a United States government vessel. I couldn't help but smirk for a moment. The sheer audacity, or maybe ignorance, of that statement was something truly special. "Ma'am, again, this isn't something you can handle this way. It's under Coast Guard jurisdiction. I can show you credentials." But she was already mid-snap with her phone, circling the boat like an amateur investigator gathering evidence. I stood there, resisting every urge to point out the literal military emblem printed on the side, not to mention the flashing barcode that government personnel could scan and check for authenticity. At that point, I realized this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. This wasn't about rules or property lines. This was about control, or at least the illusion of it. Karen wanted to feel powerful in her little kingdom of docks, fences, and neighborhood watch meetings. And I just happened to be the unlucky structure in her perfectly curated landscaping view. What she didn't realize, though, was that she wasn't dealing with some guy storing a skiff behind his house. She was trying to label active federal property as trash. And if there's one thing the government doesn't take kindly to, it's false claims and interference with operational assets. As she walked away with her phone full of evidence, and her mind set on submitting my boat as a community violation, I already knew what I had to do next. This wasn't just annoying anymore. This was serious. And Karen? Well, she was about to get a crash course in what happens when you try to enforce HOA rules on the United States Coast Guard. Stay tuned because this story was only just beginning, and little did Karen know, her clipboard wasn't going to save her from federal jurisdiction. The very next day I walked out expecting to enjoy my morning routine. Maybe check the oil levels, run a quick diagnostic, nothing major. But instead of a peaceful maintenance session, I was greeted by something that genuinely made my jaw drop. A bright orange sticker, right smack in the middle of my boat's main console. Impossible to miss. It read in bold all caps. Abandoned property, subject to removal. HOA violation. Fines up to $100 per day. Let me be clear, I've seen a lot in my career with the Coast Guard. I've stared down hurricanes, done ocean rescues, and handled classified federal missions. But this was a new kind of surreal. The sticker looked like something you'd slap on an abandoned shopping cart in a Walmart parking lot. Except this wasn't some junked-out canoe. This was federal maritime equipment, maintained, authorized, and operating under active duty jurisdiction. Next to the sticker was a folded paper taped down with some cheap office tape. I peeled it off and opened it. An actual violation notice, complete with checkboxes. Karen had been thorough. I'll give her that. Unauthorized vessel. Nuisance to community appearance. And obstructing shared waterline. All checked in angry ink. It even listed a removal deadline and the beginning of a daily fine cycle if the boat wasn't cleared from premises. I shook my head, baffled but not surprised. This woman wasn't playing. She wasn't just being difficult. She was making a full documented push to get my boat removed, completely oblivious to how far out of her depth she was. Within the hour I was at the HOA office. The little building that was usually empty now felt like ground zero. I walked in calmly, violation in hand, and approached the front desk. The receptionist glanced up, clearly unsure of what I was about to say. "I need to speak with the HOA manager," I said, maintaining the same controlled tone I used during inspections at sea. He's not in today," she replied. "Is this about the boat situation?" I gave her a look. "Yes, you could say that." She hesitated, glancing at some cluttered binders on her desk. "We've actually had multiple reports filed on that boat over the weekend." "How many?" I asked. She paused, tapped a few keys on her computer, then looked at me with a tentative smile. 4. All from the same person." She stopped and lowered her voice. "Karen." Of course. I already knew the answer before she said it, but hearing it confirmed just how determined Karen was to turn this minor inconvenience, a temporary docked vessel, into a federal case. Ironically enough, that's exactly what she was about to get, just not in the way she imagined. Without a word, I reached into my wallet and slid my Coast Guard ID onto the counter. Clipped next to it, my active duty credentials and a printed authorization letter verifying the boat's temporary status, signed and stamped by my commanding officer. "Please inform the board that this vessel is the property of the United States Coast Guard. It is federally owned. It's positioned here for reasons related to base infrastructure, and has full operational clearance to remain docked at this location until further notice." The receptionist blinked. I could tell this was miles beyond the normal barking dog complaints or fence height disputes she usually typed in. She picked up the ID like it might buzz, carefully looking it over. I'll make sure they see this," she stammered. "Great," I said. "If they need more documents, I'll provide them. But this," I held up the violation notice and slapped it, gently but firmly, on the desk. "This needs to be rescinded immediately." She nodded, typing rapidly, clearly rattled. I took a slow breath before leaving. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was firm. Because this wasn't just someone being annoying. This was a person attempting to override federal jurisdiction, with a clipboard and a rulebook meant to regulate lawn gnomes and mailbox designs. As I exited, I glanced toward the waterline in Karen's property just across from mine. Curtains fluttered. Was someone watching me? Probably. I wouldn't be surprised if she was already planning the next step in her crusade against the abandoned eyesore. But here's the thing about people like Karen, they're used to winning. They're used to steamrolling people with empty rules and loud voices. What they're not used to is facing someone who knows the law and has it in writing. I wasn't about to be bullied by someone who thought HOA authority could override the Department of Homeland Security. What Karen didn't understand was that my boat had more clearance than half the vehicles in our entire neighborhood. And as of that moment, it was war, quiet, civil, entirely legal, but war nonetheless. I tried one last time to reason with her, not out of fear or frustration but because part of me somehow still believed that logic might work. Maybe I could appeal to common sense. Maybe she just didn't know what kind of boat she was dealing with. Despite everything, I figured she deserved a real explanation before this entire situation spiraled out of control. So I walked over, Coast Guard ID in hand, and calmly said, "Karen, I respect that you're trying to follow the rules. But this is an official U.S. Coast Guard vessel. This isn't a personal boat or some forgotten fishing skiff. It's here temporarily under federal approval due to ongoing work at the base. I'm happy to show you proof." Her arms were tightly crossed, jaw clenched like she'd already decided this conversation was over before it began. I tried anyway. I held up my ID, military issued with a barcode. Then I turned toward the boat and pointed out the giant Coast Guard emblem on the side. Not a sticker, not painted on, but laser-etched and sealed under composite coating. This wasn't amateur hour. Still, I wasn't done. I pulled out the federal documentation signed, sealed, and dated, showing this vessel's transfer to temporary residential docking, authorized by command. Not only was everything legal, it was protected under federal asset policies. I waited, expecting at least a pause, a moment of reconsideration. But no. Karen looked at me, and with that icy, smug tone that people use when they think they've cornered you in checkers, "Even though you're playing chess," she said, "anyone can print a fake badge. I've seen YouTube videos." I blinked. "Wait, what?" She doubled down without missing a beat. "I've reported this multiple times. You're just trying to dodge HOA fees. I've already spoken to our towing contractor. They'll be here this week to remove it." For a moment I was actually speechless. Not because I was scared or intimidated, far from it, but because it was just so unreal. Who in their right mind tries to tow a government-issued vessel? This wasn't a random canoe collecting leaves. This was a federal support vessel with restricted equipment built into the frame. You couldn't even tow this thing with a regular vehicle, and even trying could cause thousands of dollars in damage. The idea that she thought watching a few fake ID documentaries on YouTube gave her more authority than an active duty officer with physical, verifiable federal documentation? That was wild. But that wasn't even the most dangerous part. What made this a whole new level of serious was the fact that she was actively triggering the removal of federal government property. That's not a civil matter. That's not just an HOA issue. That's a big, red flashing light mistake on her part. The kind that involves felony-level charges for unauthorized tampering or attempted seizure of federal assets. And that's when I knew this wasn't about convincing her anymore. Documentation clearly wasn't enough. Logic? Out the window. She didn't want the truth. She wanted control. So I made a decision right there. No more warnings. No more explanations. It was time to go nuclear, the legal kind. I contacted the Coast Guard's Legal Affairs Office and explained everything, down to the sticker left on the boat and the towing threat. I forwarded her written complaints, detailed my attempts to de-escalate the situation, and supplied screenshots of the citation and photographs of the vessel's condition. Within 24 hours, the situation was flagged for legal review. And to make sure nothing dramatic happened while we handled this, the boat was listed under asset protection status, meaning any attempt to move or even board it without authorization would be met with full legal enforcement and potentially federal charges. Within hours, the HOA board had received a formal notice from Coast Guard Legal. Clear, firm language. This was government property, temporarily stationed under federal orders. Any interference would be interpreted as an obstruction of federal operation and tampering with government assets, under Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1361, which can carry prison time. But Karen, she wasn't backing off. I heard from another neighbor that she was still badmouthing me at board meetings, saying things like, "He thinks he's above the rules. And just because it says Coast Guard doesn't mean it really is." At this point, she was so deep in her fantasy, she actually believed her contractor had more authority than actual federal officers with badges and jurisdiction. And listen, I've dealt with stubborn people. I've dealt with reckless people. But Karen had somehow managed to be both, fueled by an inflated sense of self-righteousness and an unsettling confidence inspired by minutes of internet research. It was wild. It was laughable. But it was also serious because the only thing standing between a Karen and a federal obstruction charge was me choosing patience. Too bad that patience just ran out. After realizing that logic, credentials, and even federal authorization weren't enough to get Karen to back off, I knew it was time to escalate the right way. So I documented everything. The bright orange abandonment sticker. The violation notice with the daily $100 fines. The reports I got wind of from the HOA board. Her quote about YouTube and fake IDs? Yep, that one too. Screenshots. Photos. Statements. I wasn't leaving a single detail to chance. Then I headed straight to our Coast Guard base's legal office. Now, if you've never had to deal with the legal branch of the U.S. Coast Guard, let me just say they don't mess around. Their job is to protect the integrity of Coast Guard operations, assets, and personnel. So when I laid everything out in my report, including the threat of a civilian towing company interfering with official government equipment, their response was immediate. 48 hours later, no delay, no back and forth, 2 members of the Coast Guard's legal team arrived at our HOA office in full uniform. Not plain clothes. Not interns. We're talking seasoned military legal officers, with rank and presence that instantly changed the entire tone of the room. And guess who just happened to be in the office at the time? Karen. I was told what went down afterward by someone on the board, someone who had initially been skeptical about the situation, but became a very sudden believer in federal jurisdiction that morning. Karen was standing in the central office area, talking to 2 other board members about setting an example and preserving the image of the neighborhood, when the 2 Coast Guard legal officers walked in. Clipboard dropped. Mouth open. It was a moment. They didn't shout. They didn't lecture. They didn't need to. They calmly introduced themselves, provided their IDs, and unfolded a set of formal documents addressed directly to the HOA board. The board was called into an immediate off-schedule sit-down. Inside the meeting, they explained in clear professional language that the vessel in question, the one Karen had called abandoned and attempted to have towed, was not only federally owned, but also protected under active use provisions related to Department of Homeland Security operations. More importantly, they laid down the law with zero wiggle room. Any attempt to remove, touch, ticket, fine, or otherwise interfere with the vessel was a direct violation of federal law, specifically Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1361. What's that mean? It's the part of federal law that covers the willful injury or depredation against U.S. government property. In everyday terms, trying to tow, damage, or mess with a Coast Guard boat is the legal equivalent of trying to jack a government vehicle from a military base. Not just a neighborhood rules issue. It's a felony. But they didn't stop there. They issued a very firm warning. Any further harassment, actions, or interference attempted by any HOA board member, resident, or third-party contractor under HOA instruction could and would escalate into a federal obstruction case. They reminded everyone in the room that civilians or private organizations have zero authority over federally registered equipment, especially during an active deployment or mission-related holding pattern. When the officers left, they handed over the documents, along with a signed letter addressed to the board formally requesting an end to all future interaction with the vessel unless clearance was granted through the Coast Guard Command. The results were nearly immediate. The orange abandoned sticker disappeared that same afternoon. The fine notices, retracted, scrubbed from the official HOA system. As for the original complaints Karen filed, expunged and classified as invalid. But the cherry on top? The board issued me a full, formal written apology. It was actually kind of poetic, templated legal language mixed with sincere regret. They acknowledged the overreach, the misunderstanding of federal property laws, and thanked me for my service. Now you might be wondering, what about Karen? Oh, she was oddly quiet after that. In fact, her presence became a lot less visible around the neighborhood. She was absent from the next 3 HOA meetings, which, I was told, she'd previously never missed. It was almost as if the idea of facing federal legal officers again had her rethinking her entire HOA legacy. No more complaints. No more orange stickers. No more sidewalk warrior justice. It was over. And while the Coast Guard team handled it with professionalism and restraint, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing someone who had tried to use their position for personal control get put in check. Not by emotion or revenge, but by the rule of actual law. Sometimes all it takes is 2 uniforms, a document stamped in triplicate, and the quiet reminder that some things and some boats are simply above your HOA's pay grade. Now here's the real kicker. The poetic twist you couldn't script better if you tried. A month later, Karen's own little slice of rule-breaking heaven finally caught up with her. And honestly, it was the kind of justice that didn't just hit, it landed. Her prized backyard shed, the one she always talked about during HOA garden tours and refused to let anyone else borrow for storage, turned out to be in violation of 3 major HOA regulations. That's right. The very same Karen who treated the community guidelines like holy scripture had been violating them all along. Oh, the irony. First, the paint. She'd gone with this odd beige-yellow color, somewhere between banana peel and outdated kitchen cabinet. Not only was it completely outside the approved HOA paint palette, but it clashed hard with the neighborhood's uniform coastal tones. Her excuse? It's historical, claiming it matched some 1930s farmhouse look she'd seen online. Cute. Still a violation. Next, the height. The structure stood taller than allowed under Section 4.3 of the HOA's Architectural Compliance Handbook, aka max shed height, 7.5 feet. Karen stemmed to nearly 9 feet, with decorative trim that made it look more like a micro cabin than a simple backyard shed. It was big enough to park a small car inside. And the final nail? No permit ever filed. No application for additional structure, no site plan, and no board approval. Just her, a crew of workers she probably cornered at a hardware store, and a mission to construct her kingdom without question. The best part? One of the very same board members that Karen had rallied to try and fine me for abandoning government property was the one who spotted the shed issue. Turns out, while walking their dog past her fence, they noticed the structure peeking over into common view. Karen was reported. Officially. She tried to dodge it, of course. Argued at a board meeting that her shed had historical character, and that her case was totally different from those irresponsible boat owners who think they're above the rules. Let me pause and let the laughter settle. She brought up me. Unprovoked. Still sore, it seemed, from getting steamrolled by federal law. But this time, the board wasn't buying it. Not even close. In what can only be described as poetic full-circle justice, the same board she once manipulated to send me threats and fine notices now hit her with a $500 non-compliance fine. No room for negotiation. No warning letters taped to a boat this time. Just a certified letter telling her the truth she didn't want to hear. Her shed had to be repainted to an approved HOA color, cut down to regulation height, and proper permits submitted within 30 days or she'd face escalating fines. Up to $50 per day. Word spread pretty fast around the neighborhood. And let me tell you, more than a few folks walked by her house a little slower that week, taking long admiring glances at her miniature fortress of unwarranted rebellion. I even heard someone call it the Karen Castle. As for me, my boat remained docked peacefully for another 2 weeks, untouched and unbothered. The Coast Guard base completed their facility repairs, and I prepped for its return like any other routine reassignment. Never heard another word from the HOA. Never saw another sticker. Just calm silence. But I did feel something else. Every time I walked down to the dock, I knew eyes were on me. From that same upstairs window at Karen's place. Curtains shifted just enough to know someone was watching. Probably typing into Google. What is federal jurisdiction and can I call someone about it? I guess the lesson here is simple. When you spend all your time policing other people's business, you tend to overlook your own backyard, literally. Karen was so busy trying to act like the enforcer of dock discipline, she never thought to check if her own house was in order. And the moment people stopped being afraid of her, those invisible lines of power she held started to vanish. In the end, I didn't have to argue. I didn't even have to raise my voice. I let the truth and the Coast Guard legal team do the heavy lifting. And now, Karen has a shorter, bland-colored shed and a very expensive reminder that rules apply even to the rulers. So next time you see someone grabbing a clipboard in your neighborhood and marching around like they're the sheriff of suburbia, just remember, their closet might be hiding a violation or two, and karma keeps good records. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment below and tell me your craziest HOA or nosy neighbor experience. I read them all, and you might even get featured in a future video. Don't forget to hit that like button if you think Karen learned her lesson. And of course, subscribe for more real-life stories, neighborhood drama, and some sweet, sweet karma served cold.